The summer of 1991 was supposed to be like any other in the small Croatian city of Vukovar. Nestled on the banks of the Danube River, it was a place of quiet streets, modest homes, and a community that had lived together for centuries. Serbs, Croats, Hungarians, and other ethnic groups coexisted in this little city, sometimes uneasily, but for the most part, peacefully. Children played football in dusty streets, families gathered for weekend markets, and fishermen cast their nets into the wide, slow-moving river. But that summer, something changed. The collapse of Yugoslavia had begun, and the political fault lines that had once been hidden beneath the surface now erupted into full view. Croatia had declared independence, and the Yugoslav People's Army, known as the JNA, backed by Serbian nationalists, had no intention of letting the country break away without a fight. And Vukovar, a city that most people outside Yugoslavia had never even heard of, suddenly became one of the first and most brutal battlegrounds of this disintegration. Why Vukovar? Strategically, it sat on the Danube, a natural border and lifeline, and it was a gateway into Croatia. Whoever controlled Vukovar controlled the crossing points, the movement of supplies, and the psychological momentum of the war. For the Serb nationalists, taking it would mean crushing Croatian hopes early. For the Croats, defending it would mean showing the world that they were willing to resist at any cost. By late summer, the city was already surrounded. The JNA moved tanks, artillery, and soldiers into position, joined by paramilitary groups, many of whom were fueled by ethnic hatred and eager for vengeance. On the Croatian side, the defenders were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Vukovar's garrison was small, made up of Croatian National Guard fighters, local police, and a handful of civilians who took up arms. Their weaponry was outdated, their ammunition limited, and their supply lines cut off. But they had one thing the attackers didn't: the desperate determination to protect their homes, their families, and their city. When the first shells began to fall in August, the residents hoped it would be over quickly. Perhaps this was just a show of force, a scare tactic. But then the artillery didn't stop. Day after day, mortars and rockets rained down, turning apartment blocks into rubble and sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. The once quiet Danube became a reflection of destruction. Flames dancing on the water at night, smoke hanging heavy in the air. Civilians rushed into basements, transforming them into makeshift shelters. Families huddled together in the dark, listening to the thunder of explosions above them, the walls shaking, dust falling from the ceiling. For children, the lullabies of their mothers were drowned out by the distant roar of artillery fire. The Croatian defenders quickly realized that they were trapped in a nightmare of urban warfare. The JNA advanced with tanks and armored vehicles, but the narrow streets of Vukovar became a trap. Croat fighters used hit-and-run tactics, striking with Molotov cocktails, grenades, and the few anti-tank weapons they possessed. One moment a JNA column would rumble confidently through a street. The next, an explosion would erupt, a tank would burn, and soldiers would scatter. This was the paradox of Vukovar. Though outnumbered and surrounded, the defenders fought with such ferocity that the JNA could not simply storm the city. The siege dragged on, and the cost in lives grew higher every day. Meanwhile, inside the city, the civilians bore the brunt of the suffering. Hospitals filled with the wounded, but medical supplies dwindled rapidly. Electricity was cut, water became scarce, and food turned into a luxury. The city's hospital staff, led by a small group of doctors and nurses, worked tirelessly, often performing surgeries without anesthesia, operating under candlelight, with the sound of bombs echoing around them. Outside the hospital, death was everywhere. Streets were littered with debris and broken glass, cars were twisted wrecks, and homes collapsed into ruins. Yet still, the people endured. The international community watched, but did little. Journalists who managed to enter the city described it as a place of unimaginable destruction, a modern-day Stalingrad. But for the people trapped inside, it was not history, it was daily life. One Croatian defender later described the feeling: "We knew we had no chance of winning in the conventional sense, but we fought because we had no other choice. If we surrendered, our families would be slaughtered. If we ran, there was nowhere to go. So we stayed, and we fought street by street, house by house. The JNA commanders believed they could take the city in a matter of days. But Vukovar held out for weeks, then months. Every day that passed was a humiliation for the attackers, and with each failed assault, their response grew more brutal. They unleashed heavier artillery, airstrikes, and indiscriminate shelling. Entire neighborhoods vanished in a storm of fire. The sound of constant bombardment became so normal that silence, when it came, was almost more terrifying. Amid the chaos, stories of extraordinary courage emerged. Civilians risked their lives to bring water from wells under sniper fire. Families shared the last of their food with neighbors. Fighters carried wounded comrades through rubble-strewn streets, knowing they might be shot at any moment. In one famous account, a Croatian soldier held off a tank with nothing but a rocket launcher, giving his unit enough time to retreat. The defenders came to believe that they were not just fighting for Vukovar, but for the survival of Croatia itself. If Vukovar fell, it would send a message that the Croats could not withstand the might of the Yugoslav army. If it stood, it would become a symbol of resistance. And so, through September and into October, the siege intensified. The lines blurred between soldier and civilian, between front lines and homes. A mother might be baking bread one moment and running for cover the next. A father might tuck his child into a basement bed before going upstairs to man a barricade. By the end of October, the city was nearly destroyed. What had once been a lively community was reduced to rubble. Streets were unrecognizable, landmarks obliterated, entire districts leveled. The population, once over 40,000, had shrunk as many fled, but tens of thousands remained trapped inside. And still, the defenders fought. The people of Vukovar began to realize that they were no longer just living in a siege. They were part of something larger, something that would define their nation's history. The city had become a fortress of defiance, a scar on the conscience of the world, and a test of how far ordinary people could endure under extraordinary pressure. As November approached, everyone knew the end was coming. The JNA had tightened the noose. Supplies inside the city were nearly gone. Ammunition was running out. The defenders were exhausted, malnourished, and wounded. Civilians were barely surviving. Yet no one wanted to be the first to surrender. What would happen when the city finally fell? No one knew, but whispers spread in the basements and bunkers. If captured, the men might be executed, the women brutalized, and the city erased. These fears were not paranoia. They were grounded in the grim reality of the war that was engulfing Yugoslavia. Vukovar was no longer just a battle. It was a tragedy unfolding in real time, one that would shock the world and leave scars that remain visible even today. And in those final days of October 1991, as the walls closed in, one truth became undeniable. The Siege of Vukovar was not just about territory. It was about survival, identity, and the brutal costs of nationalism unleashed. The storm was about to reach its climax. The summer of 1991 pressed down on Vukovar like a suffocating blanket. The city's narrow streets, once alive with the chatter of markets and the laughter of children, had transformed into avenues of barricades, sandbags, and improvised defenses. What had started as a political crisis had spiraled into a full-scale war. And Vukovar, perched on the banks of the Danube, became the center of it all. The Yugoslav People's Army, known as the JNA, was no longer the distant guardian of a multi-ethnic federation. It was now an invading force, equipped with tanks, artillery, and an arsenal that dwarfed anything the defenders of Vukovar could muster. Yet, for all the might of the JNA, the city did not crumble. It stiffened. It resisted. And soon, Vukovar became more than just a strategic location. It became a symbol of defiance, a fortress carved out of desperation and willpower. In August, as shells began to fall with greater regularity, the city's defenders realized that there would be no quick relief. Croatia's newly formed forces were young, under-equipped, and fractured by the sheer speed of Yugoslavia's collapse. Vukovar stood largely on its own, with a small but determined band of fighters, volunteers, police units, and a handful of soldiers who refused to abandon their homes. The first step was fortification. Entire neighborhoods were turned into defensive zones. Windows were bricked up, basements converted into bunkers. Cars were overturned across intersections, while steel beams and tree trunks blocked the avenues where tanks might roll. Children, women, and the elderly carried sandbags through the night, forming walls along doorways and alleys. Even playgrounds, once filled with swings and laughter, became strong points in a city preparing for siege. The defenders had one major obstacle. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The JNA brought in artillery batteries that rained destruction from beyond the horizon. Tanks patrolled the outskirts, cutting off supplies, strangling the city. Yet, the people of Vukovar devised a solution. They turned their knowledge of the streets, the alleys, the courtyards, the hidden passages, into weapons of war. A handful of men could ambush an armored column and vanish before reinforcements arrived. The city itself became a labyrinth designed to swallow the enemy. But there was another weapon, more powerful than Molotov cocktails or hidden rifles: determination. For every building destroyed, families moved into basements and carried on. For every street flattened by artillery, fighters dug trenches and refused to yield. Vukovar was not simply defending territory, it was defending identity, dignity, survival itself. By September, the siege was in full effect. The JNA closed in with overwhelming firepower, but inside the city, resistance stiffened. Water supplies dwindled, electricity failed, and food grew scarce. The hospital, under the leadership of dedicated doctors and nurses, became both sanctuary and battlefield. Surgeries were performed under candlelight, with generators sputtering and the constant tremor of shells shaking the walls. Doctors stitched wounds without anesthesia, while patients were sometimes carried in wheelbarrows through the ruined streets. Despite the horrors, morale remained defiant. Radio broadcasts from the city became a lifeline for Croatians across the country. The voices crackling through the static spoke of resilience, of courage, of a city standing against impossible odds. Vukovar was no longer just a dot on the map. It was the heart of a struggle for independence. And that heart was beating loudly. The JNA, frustrated by the stubborn defense, escalated their assault. Waves of infantry moved in behind tanks, attempting to breach the barricades. But the defenders of Vukovar had prepared. They used hit-and-run tactics, striking when least expected. A single sniper could pin down an entire squad. Small teams armed with little more than RPGs and determination took out armored vehicles, turning the wreckage into yet another barricade. The city itself seemed to conspire with the defenders. Narrow streets forced tanks into choke points, where they became easy targets. Ruined buildings provided cover for ambushes. And while the JNA had overwhelming numbers, the defenders had unity of purpose. They were not fighting for orders from a distant command. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their survival. Life for civilians became unbearable. Days were marked by hunger and fear, nights by the endless thunder of shelling. Families huddled together in basements, listening as bombs reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Mothers whispered lullabies to calm their children, even as the walls shook with each blast. Bread was rationed, water collected from shell craters, and medicine became rarer than gold. Yet, even amid such misery, the spirit of defiance persisted. The siege created unlikely heroes. Ordinary men and women became legends in the alleys of Vukovar. Farmers who once tilled fields now carried rifles. Teachers who once stood in classrooms now organized supply lines and evacuation routes. Teenagers, barely old enough to dream of adulthood, carried messages through the ruins, acting as runners between defensive positions. And while many perished, their stories became woven into the identity of the city. The defenders had one hope: that Croatia's forces beyond the city would break through and relieve them. But the reality was grim. Croatia was still organizing its army, still struggling to secure weapons, still learning how to fight. Reinforcements were scarce, and Vukovar remained isolated, surrounded, and increasingly desperate. Still, the city held on. Each day felt like borrowed time, yet each day also carried symbolic weight. The longer Vukovar resisted, the more it inspired. The longer it stood, the more it embarrassed the JNA, which expected a swift victory. And in that contrast lay the power of the siege. Vukovar was not simply delaying defeat, it was redefining the meaning of resistance. By October, the destruction reached apocalyptic levels. Streets were unrecognizable, reduced to smoking ruins. Entire blocks were flattened, leaving nothing but piles of concrete and twisted steel. The hospital overflowed with the wounded, its corridors lined with makeshift beds. Yet still, the Croatian flag fluttered defiantly above the ruins, a symbol that the city was not yet conquered. The defenders began to call their city the Croatian Stalingrad. It was not an exaggeration. Just as Stalingrad had been a turning point in World War II, Vukovar was becoming a defining battle in the Croatian War of Independence. Outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated, the defenders had turned the city into a fortress of willpower. And like Stalingrad, every street, every house, every corner became a battlefield. The JNA escalated again, bringing in more tanks, more artillery, more men. They cut the city off completely, tightening the noose. Still, Vukovar did not surrender. Even as ammunition ran low, even as hunger gnawed at stomachs, even as the wounded filled every corner of the hospital, the defenders carried on. They had no illusions of victory in the conventional sense. Their goal was survival, resistance, defiance. And in that, they were succeeding. In November, as the siege dragged into its third month, exhaustion took its toll. The city was broken, yet unbroken. Fighters who had not slept for days rotated between the front lines and the basements where their families waited. The hospital staff worked around the clock, improvising with dwindling supplies. Civilians continued to endure, clinging to the hope that help would arrive. But the reality was that Vukovar was running out of time. And yet, amid the darkness, there remained light. Stories of extraordinary courage filtered through the ruins. Men carrying the wounded under fire, women risking their lives to fetch water, children sharing their last scraps of food. These were the moments that defined Vukovar, moments that transcended the battlefield. The city was not simply resisting an army, it was embodying an idea, that even in the face of overwhelming force, the human spirit could refuse to break. Vukovar was not just a fortress, it was a statement, a declaration that even the most brutal siege could not extinguish the will to resist. And though the walls were crumbling, though the people were exhausted, the city's heart still beat with defiance. The stage was set for the final act of the siege. The JNA was determined to crush Vukovar once and for all, while the defenders prepared for the inevitable. What followed would be the climax of one of the most brutal battles of the Yugoslav War. A battle that would leave scars not just on a city, but on an entire nation. The third month of the siege turned Vukovar into something unrecognizable. What had once been a proud river town, filled with schools, cafes, and families strolling along the Danube, was now a carcass of stone and rubble. Buildings collapsed under the relentless artillery, streets were gutted by craters, and entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. The city was not just under siege, it was dying slowly, piece by piece, block by block. And yet, within the ruins, a stubborn pulse of defiance refused to fade. By November 1991, the defenders of Vukovar numbered only around 2,000, outgunned, exhausted but still holding on. They were surrounded by a force of almost 30,000 from the Yugoslav People's Army and paramilitary groups. The imbalance was grotesque. The attackers had tanks, artillery, air support, and a constant flow of reinforcements. The defenders had dwindling supplies, homemade weapons, and the willpower of men and women who had nothing left to lose. For the people inside the city, life was no longer measured in days but in minutes of survival. Water was scarce. Food was almost gone. Families lived underground in basements, emerging only at night to search for something to eat or to gather firewood from the splintered ruins of what used to be their neighbors' homes. Parents told their children to whisper to avoid attracting attention. Silence became a form of survival. The city hospital was overflowing. Its walls shook with every shell that landed nearby. Inside, doctors and nurses worked without anesthesia, without proper equipment, sometimes even without electricity. Amputations were carried out with hand saws sterilized in boiling water. Blood pooled on the floors. The cries of the wounded were constant. Yet despite the horror, the hospital became a symbol, proof that even in the darkest of circumstances, humanity tried to resist annihilation. Meanwhile, on the front lines within the city, the defenders clung to every street corner. Battles erupted not over districts but over individual houses. Snipers ruled from shattered rooftops. The sound of gunfire echoed endlessly through the ruins. One building might change hands 3 times in a single day, Croatian defenders pushing forward at dawn, Yugoslav troops reclaiming it by noon, then losing it again by nightfall. The battle was microscopic in scale, yet epic in its brutality. Among the defenders, names like Blago Zadro and Vesna Božanac became legendary. Zadro, a commander of local forces, inspired his men with unshakable resolve, urging them to fight for every inch of their homeland. Božanac, the head of Vukovar Hospital, stood as a figure of courage amid unimaginable suffering. Their leadership gave the trapped citizens a sense of purpose, that they were not merely dying in vain, but resisting against impossible odds to prove that Croatia's struggle for independence was real. Outside the city, the world watched, some in horror, many in silence. Foreign journalists who managed to sneak in described Vukovar as a Croatian Stalingrad. The comparison was not an exaggeration. The intensity of destruction, the sheer scale of civilian suffering, and the determination of the defenders echoed the darkest chapters of the Second World War. Yet unlike Stalingrad, Vukovar received no massive reinforcements, no tanks pouring in to turn the tide. It was alone. For the Yugoslav People's Army, frustration was mounting. Victory should have come easily, but the resistance inside the city was far stronger than anticipated. Tanks bogged down in urban combat, unable to maneuver in the maze of rubble. Soldiers suffered ambushes at every turn. Supply lines stretched thin. The leadership in Belgrade wanted Vukovar as a quick, decisive conquest to crush Croatian morale. Instead, the battle was dragging into an international spectacle, exposing the cruelty of the siege to the entire world. That cruelty was deliberate. The shelling was no longer just military, it was psychological warfare. Churches were targeted, schools obliterated, civilian shelters bombed. The message was clear: surrender or perish. Yet the defenders did not surrender. Each new ruin seemed to harden their determination. To them, survival was already a form of victory, but the cost was staggering. Entire families vanished under collapsing buildings. Graves appeared in courtyards and backyards because it was too dangerous to reach the cemeteries. Wooden crosses, hastily carved, marked the dead. Some bodies lay unburied, trapped beneath rubble, becoming part of the ruined landscape. The city itself was becoming a graveyard. The Danube, once a lifeline, became a border of death. Patrols on the river ensured that no one could escape, no aid could enter. Attempts to cross were met with gunfire. Those caught trying to flee were sometimes executed. For the defenders, retreat was impossible. Their fate was tied to the ruins around them. Inside the hospital, the scenes grew more desperate by the day. Doctors wept openly as they tried to save children whose bodies were shredded by shrapnel. Medicine ran out, forcing improvisations that bordered on medieval practices. Yet amid the blood and the stench of death, the hospital's staff carried on. To them, giving up was not an option. They were the last fragile thread of humanity in a city drowning in barbarity. By mid-November, the fall of Vukovar was inevitable. Ammunition was nearly gone. The defenders fought with whatever they could find: Molotov cocktails, hunting rifles, even knives. Some described their weapons as the will to fight more than anything material. Yet they held on, day after day, turning the city into a black hole of attrition that devoured both sides. As the Yugoslav army prepared its final offensive, the mood among the defenders shifted. Some still clung to hope that reinforcements might arrive. Others accepted that death was imminent. For many, the fight had become symbolic. If Vukovar fell, it would not be because its people had surrendered, but because they had been overwhelmed by sheer force. The final push began with a storm of artillery so intense that even veterans of earlier battles called it unimaginable. Buildings that had somehow remained standing crumbled in hours. Smoke covered the sky. The air was filled with dust and ash, choking the lungs of those who tried to breathe. Tanks rolled forward through streets that no longer existed, their treads crushing both rubble and corpses. House by house, the defenders were forced back. Resistance was still fierce. Every corner had to be taken at a cost. But the end was near. Some defenders refused to retreat, choosing instead to die in place, fighting until their last bullet. Others tried to regroup in the center of the city, but there was nowhere left to hide. And then silence. By November 18, 1991, the guns fell quiet. After 87 days of siege, the city was in ruins. Vukovar had fallen. But the true horror was only just beginning. For the surviving defenders and civilians, capture did not mean safety. Columns of prisoners were marched out of the city. Some were beaten, others executed. The most infamous atrocity was yet to come, at the Ovkara farm, where hundreds of prisoners taken from the hospital would be massacred in cold blood. Vukovar was not only a battlefield. It was the site of a crime against humanity that would stain the memory of the war forever. The fall of Vukovar sent shockwaves across Croatia and the world. For Croatians, it became both a tragedy and a symbol of resistance. For the Yugoslav army, it was a hollow victory. Yes, the city was taken, but at a cost so great that it eroded their reputation and exposed their brutality to global scrutiny. And for the survivors, it was the beginning of a new nightmare. Displacement, imprisonment, and the haunting memory of a city turned into dust. As the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, the ruins of Vukovar stood as testimony. The city was gone, its population broken, yet its spirit had achieved something paradoxical. By refusing to surrender until the very end, Vukovar had etched itself into history not just as a defeat, but as a legend of defiance. The world would remember the ruins. The world would remember the hospital. The world would remember the children buried under rubble, the defenders who fought with nothing but willpower, and the silence of those who could have intervened but chose not to. Vukovar was destroyed, but its story was only beginning. The third month of the siege brought with it a kind of darkness that was more than just the absence of light. It was the feeling that the world outside had moved on, that Vukovar's fate was sealed, and that all that remained was the slow, crushing weight of inevitability. For the defenders, each day was a cycle of shelling, waiting, and running from one ruined corner to another. For the civilians, life had collapsed into an endless series of basements, rationing scraps of food, and praying that the walls around them would not collapse with the next explosion. But the truth was that both sides were reaching their breaking points. The Yugoslav People's Army had thrown everything at Vukovar: artillery, tanks, air power, infantry, and yet the city refused to surrender. It was a wound that refused to close, and it became both a symbol and an embarrassment. The defenders, meanwhile, were running on little more than adrenaline and desperation. Ammunition was nearly gone. Food supplies had dwindled to crumbs. Medicine was non-existent, and still they held on, as if the crumbling walls of Vukovar were the last shield for the whole of Croatia. By November, the siege had already earned its infamous reputation. The landscape of Vukovar was no longer recognizable. Entire neighborhoods were flattened into seas of rubble. Landmarks were erased. Schools, hospitals, churches, all shattered. The city was now nothing but broken stone and broken lives. And yet, in the middle of this wasteland, the defenders clung to the idea that if they could just hold a little longer, international pressure might intervene. If they could just last another day, another week, perhaps Croatia would get the help it needed. But the Yugoslav command was equally determined. They saw Vukovar not just as a city, but as a message. If the Croatian defenders could be crushed here, if this symbol of resistance could be wiped out, then it would send a warning to the rest of the newly declared Croatian state. Vukovar had to fall, and so the pressure only increased. One of the most infamous aspects of this stage of the siege was the fate of the Vukovar hospital. For weeks, it had been functioning under impossible conditions, without power, without sufficient medicine, operating rooms in basements lit by candles. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, treating both civilians and wounded fighters. The hospital had become a refuge, a fragile bubble of humanity in a city consumed by destruction. But as the Yugoslav army closed in, the hospital became a target. Rumors spread among the defenders that the wounded would not be spared, that even here, the brutality of the war would cross lines that most thought untouchable. And the rumors were right. In mid-November, after Vukovar had effectively fallen, the hospital was entered by Yugoslav forces and paramilitary groups. Patients, including civilians, were taken away. Many of them never returned. The name Avkara, a farm just outside the city, would later become synonymous with massacre. It was here that over 200 people taken from the hospital were executed. For survivors and for Croatia, it was proof of what Vukovar had meant. Not just a military defeat, but a humanitarian catastrophe. Meanwhile, among the defenders, the final days of the battle carried an almost surreal atmosphere. Many had stopped believing they would survive. Some had written farewell notes to their families, hidden in the rubble or handed to civilians in hopes they might be smuggled out. There were stories of fighters, down to their last magazine, who whispered prayers before going back into the ruined streets, determined to fight until the end. Others simply collapsed from exhaustion, sitting in the corners of basements and staring blankly as shells rained above them. And yet, even here, there were moments of defiance. Radio Vukovar, the city's last connection to the outside world, continued to broadcast. Its voice, transmitted through crackling static, carried messages of hope, despair, and raw defiance. The broadcasts became legendary across Croatia, symbols of courage that inspired others to resist. When the voice finally went silent, it was like the last heartbeat of the city itself. For the Yugoslav army, the final push into the city was both victory and nightmare. Street by street, house by house, they advanced through ruins where every corner might hide a sniper, every basement might contain an ambush. The cost in lives was staggering. Soldiers described it as walking into hell, a place where shadows fought back, where the dead seemed to outnumber the living, where the city itself resisted. By the time they declared victory, it was hard to say who had truly won. Vukovar was gone, destroyed. The defenders were dead, captured, or scattered. And yet, the moral cost of what had been done weighed heavily on the attackers as well. Outside Vukovar, the fall of the city sent shockwaves across Croatia and the wider world. For Croatians, it was both a tragedy and a rallying cry. The images of the destroyed city, the stories of massacres, the sight of survivors being marched into captivity, they all fueled anger and determination. Vukovar became a martyr, a symbol of sacrifice that defined the Croatian struggle for independence. For the international community, however, the response was muted. There was outrage, yes, but little action. Vukovar had cried out to the world, and the world had looked away. This sense of abandonment left scars that would last for decades. Survivors of the siege often spoke of how they felt betrayed, not just by the brutality of their attackers, but by the silence of those who could have intervened. For them, Vukovar was not just a battlefield, but proof of how cruel indifference could be. And so, the consequences of the siege stretched far beyond November 1991. The destruction of Vukovar became a turning point in the Croatian War of Independence. On the one hand, it was a devastating blow. A city erased, thousands killed, tens of thousands displaced. On the other hand, it hardened Croatia's resolve. It showed what was at stake, and it gave the Croatian people a symbol of resistance that would fuel them through the long years of war ahead. But there was another consequence, one that would haunt the region for generations. The cycle of vengeance. The atrocities committed in and around Vukovar, massacres, expulsions, destruction, would leave deep scars between communities. For Serbs and Croats alike, Vukovar became a symbol not just of resistance or conquest, but of grievance. Every destroyed building, every executed civilian, every displaced family planted seeds of bitterness that would be hard to heal. Looking back, the brutality of Vukovar feels almost surreal, as if it belonged to another century. Yet it happened in Europe in the final decade of the 20th century, under the eyes of television cameras and international observers. That is perhaps the most chilling aspect, that such devastation and cruelty unfolded in plain sight. For many in the West, Vukovar was the first real warning of the horrors that would consume the Balkans in the 1990s. It was a glimpse into a conflict that was not just about territory, but about identity, revenge, and survival at all costs. As survivors emerged from the rubble, many could barely speak. Some wandered through the ruins, dazed, searching for family members who would never return. Others were herded into buses, their fate uncertain. For those who escaped, the images of their city burning behind them would never fade. For those who stayed, captivity brought new horrors, camps, interrogations, executions. And for those who died, the ruins of Vukovar became their unmarked graves. In the end, the fall of Vukovar was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the city as it had once been, a vibrant place of life and culture. It ended the hope that the war might be short or that civilians might be spared. But it also began a new chapter in the Croatian struggle, one defined by resilience, sacrifice, and the memory of what had been lost. The name Vukovar became etched into the national consciousness, a wound and a banner at the same time. And that is the paradox of Vukovar. It was destroyed, yet it became immortal. Its people were crushed, yet their memory became a force stronger than the army that tried to erase them. Its ruins spoke louder than any propaganda, its silence louder than any declaration of victory. For Croatia, and for the world, Vukovar was proof that sometimes the greatest battles are not about winning or losing, but about enduring long enough for the truth to be seen. When the guns finally fell silent over Vukovar in late November 1991, the city no longer resembled a city at all. It was a graveyard of shattered walls, scorched earth, and silence. An apocalyptic canvas painted by 3 months of relentless shelling. The once bustling streets had been transformed into trenches of rubble. The Danube still flowed, indifferent, carrying with it the ashes of a place that had become synonymous with resistance and tragedy. But Vukovar's story did not end with the fall of its defenses. What followed was as chilling, if not more so, than the siege itself. The human cost revealed itself in waves. Executions, mass graves, refugee columns, and the long, heavy shadow of ethnic cleansing. The battle had been about territory, but its aftermath became a defining moment in the violence that would consume the Balkans throughout the 1990s. As Serb forces occupied the ruins, the fate of thousands of Croatian soldiers and civilians came under the control of an army driven by rage, vengeance, and nationalist zeal. What happened next turned Vukovar into a symbol not just of resistance, but of horror. The survivors were rounded up, herded into columns, and separated by age, gender, and suspected loyalty. Men of fighting age were considered prisoners of war, though the conventions of Geneva were quickly abandoned in the dust of vengeance. Women, children, and the elderly were sent away, some transported to refugee camps, others allowed to flee. For the men, especially those believed to have resisted, the fate was often sealed at places like Ofkara Farm. It was here, in the days following the fall of the city, that one of the most infamous massacres of the war unfolded. Over 200 prisoners, wounded fighters, doctors, and even civilians were taken from Vukovar's hospital under the pretense of relocation. Instead, they were executed, their bodies dumped into mass graves. The chilling efficiency of this atrocity demonstrated that Vukovar was not just a military conquest. It was intended as a message. Defiance would be punished, and the cost of resistance would be measured in blood. Perhaps what made the tragedy of Vukovar even more unbearable was the silence or impotence of the international community. The world had watched, through grainy news footage and desperate pleas from journalists on the ground, as the city was bombarded daily. Calls for intervention echoed in Western capitals, but they were met with hesitation, bureaucracy, and political caution. The United Nations, still grappling with the new post-Cold War order, failed to act decisively. Europe, paralyzed by divisions and the complexity of the Yugoslav crisis, debated endlessly while the shells fell. And so, Vukovar fell not only to the Yugoslav People's Army but also to the indifference of a world unwilling to risk involvement in a conflict that seemed too complicated, too far away. This abandonment became part of the city's legacy. To Croats, Vukovar symbolized not just courage but betrayal, proof that they would have to fight alone for their survival. As Serb forces consolidated their control, tens of thousands of civilians fled westward. Refugee columns stretched for miles, people carrying little more than what they could fit into a bag. Families were torn apart in the chaos. Children lost parents, husbands lost wives, and entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. The fall of Vukovar triggered a wave of ethnic cleansing across eastern Croatia. Villages were burned, and non-Serb populations were expelled. For Croatia, this was not merely the fall of a city but a deep wound in the national psyche. At the same time, the images of the destruction shocked the Croatian public. The government in Zagreb, still struggling to organize its fledgling military, now faced a stark reality. Survival would demand total mobilization. Vukovar's destruction hardened resolve. It became a rallying cry, a grim reminder that independence would only come through unimaginable sacrifice. In the years that followed, Vukovar transcended its physical reality. The ruins remained, but they became more than ruins. They became symbols. For Croats, Vukovar was their Alamo, a place where the few stood against the many, where the defense of the homeland was written in fire and blood. The destroyed water tower, riddled with hundreds of shell holes, was left standing as a silent witness, a monument to resilience. Every year, Croats commemorated the fall with candlelit processions, carrying torches through the night to remember those who had died. Vukovar became not just a tragedy but a cornerstone of national identity. For Serbs, the memory was far more conflicted. Official narratives often portrayed the victory as a liberation, a military triumph. Yet beneath the propaganda lay a recognition that the brutality of Vukovar would forever stain Serbia's role in the war. The massacres, the mass graves, and the sheer devastation made it impossible to speak of Vukovar without confronting the darker truths of nationalism unleashed. In the aftermath of the war, international tribunals sought to bring justice to those responsible. Commanders of the Yugoslav People's Army and local Serb paramilitaries were indicted for war crimes, particularly for the Vukovar massacre. Some were convicted, others denied responsibility, and many remained unpunished. But justice came slowly, and for many survivors it was incomplete. The scars of Vukovar ran deeper than any tribunal could reach. The city's ruins were rebuilt brick by brick, but the memories could not be erased. To this day, survivors carry with them the trauma of what they endured, memories of endless shelling, of friends buried under rubble, of neighbors executed in fields at dawn. Denial also persisted. In Serbia, many continued to downplay or distort the events, framing them as unfortunate but necessary acts of war. In Croatia, Vukovar remained sacred, untouchable, a symbol of purity in a conflict filled with moral ambiguity. The battle for Vukovar did not just shape the Croatian War of Independence. It shaped the wars that followed across Bosnia and Kosovo. It demonstrated the extremes to which ethnic conflict could descend. It showed that cities could be besieged not only to defeat enemies but to erase entire communities. And it taught the world a lesson it should have already known: that waiting, debating, and hesitating in the face of atrocity only empowers the aggressors. When Sarajevo later fell under siege, when Srebrenica was massacred, the shadow of Vukovar hung heavy. The world's failure to act in 1991 set the stage for failures that would repeat again and again throughout the decade. Today, Vukovar has been rebuilt. The streets are paved, the buildings restored, and life has returned. But beneath the surface, the ghosts remain. Entire generations live with the trauma, and the divisions of ethnicity still cut deep. Visitors who walk through the city cannot escape the sense that this is not just a city. It is a memorial. Every corner, every building, carries the weight of history. The silence of the Danube, once indifferent, now seems heavy, as if it too remembers. And for Croats, Vukovar remains a sacred place. Every soldier who fought there is remembered as a hero. Every civilian who endured the siege is honored as a martyr of freedom. The story of Vukovar is no longer just history. It is part of Croatia's identity. The Siege of Vukovar was not merely a battle. It was the brutal birth of a nation, the crucible in which Croatia's independence was forged. But it was also a tragedy, a warning of what nationalism, hatred, and unchecked violence can unleash. To this day, questions linger. Could the world have stopped it? Could the suffering have been lessened? Or was Vukovar doomed from the moment the first shell fell? What is certain is this: Vukovar stands as a monument to both the resilience of the human spirit and the depths of human cruelty. It is a reminder that in war, cities may fall, but their memory rises higher than any army. And so, as the torches burn each November in Croatia, as survivors tell their stories, as new generations learn of what happened, Vukovar endures, not as ruins, not as ashes, but as a voice whispering across time, never again.